Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Faith and Recovery Live. Once again, I'm outdoors, but I don't think I'm going to have to deal with rain today, and that's nice. I am looking forward to spending just a few moments with you all, going over the topic of burnout. Burnout is one of the topics that somebody posted in response to my invitation this past week or week before last, I think it was. And so we're going to talk about that today, this evening. This is Faith and Recovery Live. And so we're going to talk about burnout in regards to recovery. And we're going to talk about burnout in regards to faith as well. We are going to look at what does burnout look like. We're going to look at what are some things you can do to prevent burnout, and then what are some things to do, to respond to burnout. When you find yourself already in that spot, what are some things you can do to minimize the damage and perhaps even heal from the damage of burnout. So, first of all, I think a good thing to do would be look at a definition. So what's a definition of burnout? I think that there's a lot of different ways that people can categorize burnout. They can classify it. They can talk about it. But I do think that one common thing that is across the board for all the different kinds of burnout is the inability to keep going at the same pace. So when burnout happens, there's this idea that I was operating at this level and now I have to drop to this level because I just can't keep up. So there's a reduction in the pace or the amount that I'm doing or whatever I'm involved in. I think also there is an increase in cost. So let's say I was performing here and I've got to drop to here. But when I'm going through burnout, not only am I dropping my level of performance, I have to increase my level of payout. I have to put more effort into it to get less out of it. So if this is in my recovery, I have to do more recovery work, and yet I feel less peace. I feel less serenity. So I'm having to push harder, and yet I'm sliding backwards. I think that's a common piece of burnout. I think another thing in burnout, oh, hey, Paris, good to see you. Another thing in burnout is the problem of it starts to feel like the ground is shifting. So when we go into burnout, there is a sense of these were the things I believed. These are the things that I understood to be true. These are the things that I accepted as real. And I go into burnout and I start to question them. I start to doubt them. I start to look and say, is this really real? Is this really how it works? Can I still trust in the things I used to trust in? I had a way of living. I had a way of thinking. I had a way of processing. And now it's not working. So what's going on? Is it me? Is it the situation? So there's this questioning, this doubt, I think is the best word I can give it. And I think what happens a lot of times in burnout is if it's not dealt with, if it's not recognized, and if it's not dealt with, then what happens is we have to stop whatever it is we're doing. If it's our faith, we have to leave that church. If it's our recovery, hopefully we don't relapse, but we may. Because what we're doing, it actually grinds to a halt. Burnout can't last forever. Like we talk about burnout as if it's a thing that you can just kind of do for a while, but it actually brings everything to a screeching halt. Burnout is a lot of times seen as something that you just kind of feel as you keep going forward, but true burnout requires either a change of course or a complete shutdown. Like that's what burnout is. Now, when we talk about stopping, I don't think the burnout that I have seen and that I have in some measure experienced, I don't think that it was like a big semi running into like an oak tree or something. Like it just stops, boom, and it stopped, like a sudden stop. I don't think that's what it's like. I think it's more like when I've seen like videos of like trucks coming down a mountain and they are, their brakes go out and they go into one of those like escape ramps on the road. There's like this gradual slowing because the way those ramps are built is to bog the truck down. The truck can't keep going fast because it's sand and it just drags the whole thing. And I think that's what the burnout that I have felt and the burnout that I've seen in people's lives, I think that's what it's more like. It's not like a sudden crash that happens. It's more like a buildup. It's a cumulative effect. Little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit is what happens, and that's how the slow progression of burnout happens. So that's what I would say burnout looks like. What is the cost of burnout? Well, I kind of already just mentioned it, but what is the cost of burnout? The cost of burnout is that whatever it is we were doing that we found valuable, and that's why we did it in the first place, we're not going to be able to keep doing it. If we get burned out in a job, maybe we got hired onto that job because we really liked it. We liked the work, we liked the people, we liked the location, we liked the pay, but after a while, if we get burned out, we have to quit. We have to move on. Like we can't keep doing that job. If it's a church, maybe we went to that church because we believed like they did, or maybe we felt at home, maybe we felt safe. Once again, maybe it was location, whatever it was, there were things we valued about going there, being a part of that community, and yet the burnout happens and we have to go away. If you're in leadership, if you're a pastor or a recovery ministry leader, or maybe you just are a leader in the sense of trying to lead some people that you know, like being the person in the relationship that leads. If we go into burnout, if we suffer burnout, we will find ourselves not being able to lead. We will have to step away from that leadership role. When that happens, especially, it's very common when that happens for there to be what you might call collateral damage. So people that maybe they're not burned out, but they suffer the effects of someone else going through burnout because that's the person they were following. That's the person they were being served by. That's the person they were, that was their sponsor. That was their pastor. That was their boss at work. However this happens, there's the collateral damage of when one person suffers burnout, the ripple effects of that, it goes all the way out to the edges of the pond. And so that's kind of why we're talking about it, because it can have a huge effect. So what does burnout look like in the recovery world? What would that look like? How would that happen? Well, it's kind of what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to, explain the problem, and then you can, then you can build up to the solution. So I'm kind of tipping my hand. I'm kind of giving a little bit of the solution here before we understand the problem all the way. But what happens, what causes burnout is isolation. A lack of intimacy. Now, I know the word intimacy gets used for all kinds of stuff, okay? A lot of times in religious circles, the word intimacy is kind of like a euphemism for sexual activity. That's not what that word means. Intimacy is a relational word. It has to do with being seen and valued at an extremely deep level. So it's closeness, it's knowledge, it's value, it's being prioritized and prioritizing. Firefighters that are working well together as a team, they have intimacy. Nurses working on a person trying to bring them back to life, that's intimacy. Someone that you have met every year for vacation for 16 years, and you just know what restaurants to go to, you know where all the good spots are. That's intimacy. It's not a true definition, okay? And those of you that know me, you know I like real definitions. This is not a real definition, but it's a good illustration. You can take the word intimacy and you break it down and you say it differently. You say, into me, see. Intimacy is the capability to be transparent and yet not lose any value in the relationship. That's what intimacy is. When intimacy is not present in a task or labor, burnout is inevitable. Now, let me say that again. When intimacy is not present in a task or labor, burnout is inevitable. Because as humans, we run on intimacy. That's what fuels us. That's why babies learn to talk. That's how humans learn to be humans, is through a relational connection where we feel value and we feel known. And when that goes away, as humans, we don't run right anymore. And so whatever it is we're doing, whatever work we're trying to accomplish, whatever recovery work we're doing, it sucks us dry. Some of you also know that I am a nurse as well, so I do nursing things. And one of the things that we learn in nursing is about the heart. Little brief health lesson here. When the heart beats, it contracts and it squishes down, and that sends blood out to the rest of the body. But in between beats, the heart rests, and that means it kind of relaxes. And the pressure that it just pushed out to the rest of the body pushes back just a little bit against the heart, and it's that back pressure that actually feeds the arteries of the heart. When the heart contracts, it actually empties itself of blood. It's the back pressure, when what it has just sent life out to pushes back toward it. That's when the heart is fed, the thing in your chest. And what I'm saying is that other heart, that heart that's the seat of our passions and our desires and our feelings and our emotions, that heart is also emptied when we contract, when we do work. We squish out of ourselves this life and we push that life toward others. And when we relax, if there's no back pressure that pushes that life back toward us, we're going to burn out. It's called cardiac arrest. The heart dies. So in recovery, what this looks like is taking on service positions too soon, starting to be a leader or be a sponsor before you actually have the level of intimacy with others to feed you. It can be taking on leading a meeting too soon before you actually have enough sobriety and you have enough relationships built up, a support team built up. It can also look like, a lot of times when you're in recovery, you have to change your person, places, and things. And so you move out of the town where you know where all the spots are. You move out of that town, and then you never get to know anybody else in your new town. You just figure, well, I got away from that town, so I'm good now. No, you're not good. You got to find people to plug into. If you don't, your recovery is going to burn out. It'll be done in a year or two, and you'll be right back where you started. And what'll happen is you'll start looking for those people again. You'll find new people just like the people you left in the last town. That's what happens. It can look like not learning good self-care. So not taking care, not getting a family doctor, not going to see a dentist, not taking care of your body, working out, eating good food. It can look like that, just not doing good self-care. And after a while, the task, the labor, the work of doing recovery is too much. And there's no intimacy to carry that burden to feed you. And so you're dry, you're empty, you're done. And It can also look like not doing counseling, not doing therapy, not doing deeper work. If you're in recovery, there's a reason why it made sense to do whatever it was you did. If it was drugs or gambling or sex or relationships or whatever it was, there's a reason why that made sense to you. There's a reason why when you were in your deepest, lowest point, your brain said, hey, I have an idea. And your heart said, sure, why not? There's a reason why it made sense. And dig down into that. You don't open up enough space for intimacy to happen. And if you don't open up that space, then there's not time, there's not space, and you suffer burnout. So that's how it can look like in recovery. What does burnout look like in a faith setting? Well, in a faith setting, what it looks like sometimes is, once again, there's some similarities here. Being in a service or leadership position too soon, before you have the intimacy, I'm going to make up a word, the intimacy integrity to do that kind of work. If you take on a leadership position in a faith community and you don't have some safe place to go where you don't have to be on in that moment, you're going to burn out. You have to have that time where you relax and someone pours back into you. That's what spiritual directors do. They can be that safe place you pour back into you. If you're in a faith community, you may not have sponsor. You might see someone as a mentor. But if you don't have a place to go where you don't have to be the one in charge, the one leading, the one serving, if you don't have anyone serving back into you, in a faith community, you're going to burn out. It can also look like there's this thing that happens sometimes in faith communities and churches where we take what we know is true. We know something in our gut, okay? And I don't have time. I don't have time tonight to unpack why we say that, okay? There's a reason why we say we know it in our gut. We'll talk about that maybe some other time. But you know something is real, and yet you tell yourself, no, that's not what's happening. That's not going on. It's kind of like self-gaslighting. If you do that in a faith community, that will lead to burnout. That is the beginning of burning yourself out. It can also be very similar to the recovery situation. If you don't take time to build the relationships inside that faith community, there's going to come a point where just the work of showing up and participating is going to overtake your strength and your endurance, and you're just going to not be able to be, you won't be able to be there anymore. You won't be able to handle it anymore. So that's the ways that it can look like in a faith community. Now, what happens is, I've seen this in a lot of people. I see this in people in my generation. I've seen this in family members. I've seen this in people older than me. And I'm now beginning to see this in people younger than me. If you're in a faith community and you start to burn out, you don't just lose the ability to show up to the building. You don't just lose the ability to show up to the meeting. What you actually start to lose a grip on is the things that you believed. So you go to this church, you go to this faith community, you go to this Bible study, whatever it is, and you learn things, and you learn to think a certain way and believe certain things. And then you burn out. You don't have the intimacy to feed yourself, to keep yourself alive, to keep your heart alive. You don't have the connection. You don't have the relationships to carry the weight of the work of being around other people. And you start to burn out. And instead of just being like, oh, well, that's no big deal. Like, I'll just go somewhere else. You start to question everything you got from that place. You start to question everything you were taught, everything you believed. It's not that I'm not faulting that. I'm not faulting that at all. But I'm saying that's a symptom of the burnout problem. When you don't have intimacy space open up on the inside, you burn out in a faith community because you don't have that relationship built to carry the weight. But see, God also speaks to us that way. If I as a person am not open to intimacy, then it's not just that I can't connect with the pastor, I can't connect with the people at church, but I begin to lose the ability to connect with God. If I don't have a transparent place, if I'm not a transparent person on the inside, then the light that God shines on me doesn't get all the way down into the bottom of me. And it starts to be a dark and scary and fearful and lonely place. And so intimacy, like I said, that is when we lose our intimacy capability, that's when we fall into burnout. And when we decide it's time to get out of burnout, intimacy is where it's at. It's relationship, it's intimacy, it's connection. So what does that look like in a faith community? I have heard it said that when it's time to, get things right again, you have to go back to the same church, you have to go back to the same place, and you got to, mend those broken fences and build those broken bridges and, build an altar again, or whatever euphemism somebody wants to use, whatever figure of speech somebody wants to use. Honestly, that doesn't always work. Sometimes when humans go through burnout, you don't get to go back where you came from. Now, God is a God of grace, and He's a God of forgiveness, and He's a God of healing. But some of us aren't going to live long enough to heal the wounds that we have. If we could live that long, it would happen. But some of us aren't going to live that long. So sometimes when it's time to heal from burnout, you have to go somewhere else. That does happen. You say, well, how do I know if I'm doing it right? If you go somewhere else and yet there's bitterness that grows up, there's resentment that grows up, then whether we actually return to that original faith community or whether we stay away from it, that resentment has to be dealt with, because what is the resentment doing? The resentment is preventing intimacy, okay? The location is not always the key. Where I'm sitting is not always the point. It's where is my heart pointed? Where is my heart connected or disconnected? So sometimes healing from intimacy in a faith setting may mean doing a lot of work around forgiveness and asking God to give me the strength to forgive the people that were in that former faith community that didn't teach me how to do the work of opening my heart to being open and transparent and connected. And that's what caused me to have to leave them. Forgiving them for not knowing how to teach me how to stay with them. That's kind of a long phrase, but sometimes that's the work we have to do. Sometimes another thing that we have to do when we're healing from burnout, especially if we're a leader in a faith community, is we have to reevaluate our leadership style. Now, if you're not a leader, this may sound strange, but if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense, even if you're not in a leadership role, because all of us are leading somebody. As leaders, it's very easy to have a particular style, a particular way of doing things. If I'm going to lead a meeting, I do it this way. If I'm going to, write a sermon, I do it this way. If I'm going to get together a community event, I do it this way. And we make those decisions, we create those ways of doing things because they make sense to us. For some reason, it's the right thing to do, as far as we can tell. But if that way of doing things, no matter how efficient, no matter how effective, no matter how much it made a splash or made an impact, if it was a way of doing things that led to a decrease in intimacy, it doesn't matter how effective it is going to kill us again. We are going to burn out again. And so as a leader, sometimes we have to reevaluate that. What does it look like to do the repair work in a recovery setting? Once again, it's very similar. We have to find a way to increase the intimacy. So if we're in recovery and we go through burnout and now let's say best case scenario, let's say we're not using again, we're not acting out again, but let's say that we are at least not going to meetings, not connecting with our accountability team, not connecting with our sponsor. It's possible we may need to find a new sponsor. It's possible we may need to find a new home group. Like we may need to move. We may need to find a different way to re-engage. But once again, even if we find a different place to go, we cannot allow unforgiveness or bitterness or resentment to grow up against that former connection that we had, because that will prevent us from being open and transparent and engaged with intimacy in the next part of our life. So we've talked about intimacy, talked about how that's what our hearts run on. That's the fuel. That's what keeps us alive. That's the oxygen. We talked about intimacy being into me see, being transparent, being able to be seen and known and valued. That's intimacy. And how if we don't have that, then if we are giving and not receiving that, eventually we pump our hearts dry. We drain ourselves of the lifeblood of intimacy, and then whatever we're doing burns us out. So how do we prevent this? What would we have to do? What would we have to do to not get to this spot? Well, in faith or recovery, it's pretty much the same thing. If there's something, a task that we are considering, a role that we're considering, a job, we're considering a pastorate, a new position, whatever. And when we think about moving toward that, it doesn't feel quite right. Listen to that. Listen to that. We have learned, especially in faith communities, we have learned to be so distrustful of the embassy of heaven that is our heart, that when God tries to communicate with us, we shut him down and we decide we're not going to listen to that anymore. We have to listen to our hearts. It will tell us if we're getting ready to do something that's going to hurt it. You say, well, Brian, I don't know. I'm not sure about my heart. Maybe you say it's great to trust it. I'm not even sure. Okay, fine. Well, fair enough. If you can't write down on a piece of paper who is going to relationally and intimately support you in whatever new endeavor you're trying to take on, if you can't write 2 or 3 people down that are going to be there to pour into you, don't do it. If you can't show the math of who is going to be there to refill you and to replenish you, and I don't mean just Jesus, okay? I'm not talking about Jesus. Jesus is going to be there. God's going to be there. Higher power is going to be there. That's great. But if you can't show the people that are going to be there for you, that's not the place to go. And see, this is really hard for people who have a heart to serve and a heart to give, because we want to talk to our higher power, we want to talk to Jesus, and if we get the green light there, then we say it's time to go, and it's time to move on in. And I'm not saying God can't do miracles and provide a way. God can, and he has, he will. But he's also given us rules. He's given us wisdom. There's a whole book full of his wisdom. And his wisdom says that when you are David and you want to go into battle, you have mighty men around you, so that when you try to kill the giant and it knocks you down, your companion steps in and fights for you and keeps you alive. Read that. That's in the book. When you're the Son of God and you know it's your last night on earth, And you have to go pray to your Father and ask him to please let you live if there's any way possible. But even if he won't let you live, you'll do what he says. Do you go off by yourself? No. You take some people with you. I'm not saying that the disciples were a source for Jesus. I'm saying he was showing us that even in your darkest time, you don't go alone. You don't go alone. If there's any part of our faith or our recovery where we are standing alone, we're going to fall. That's not how it's built. That's not how it's meant to be. Anywhere we stand with. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I will show up. Our higher power does not intend for us to work in isolation. There is no I in the 12 steps. It's always we. Why is that? That's because intimacy is the lifeblood of the human. And if we don't have that, we will burn out. So what's the solution? The solution is to find ways to reconnect. Find ways to become more transparent. Do the hard work of knowing ourselves so that we can introduce our true selves to others. In faith communities, in recovery communities, that's what therapy's for, that's what counseling's for, that's what spiritual direction's for, that's what all the different things, the resources we have. We have to know ourselves better so that we can show ourselves better to somebody else. We can introduce ourselves more honestly and transparently to someone else so that we can build that intimacy. So I think that's all I want to try to say about burnout. I trust that's been helpful. I really appreciate you all logging on and spending some time with me on this Friday evening. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them attached to this video, or you can message me. If you have other topics you'd like me to address, feel free to let me know. And I will see you guys all next week. Love you.